Hello and welcome to this public policy discussion series. I'm joined by Naushad Forbes, Director Forbes Marshall and also CII President Designate. Mr. Forbes, thank you very much for speaking with us. So let me ask you a broader general question to start with. We're starting a new year, 2016. What are the three economic challenges to growth that you see ahead of us? Could be short term and long term.
Sure. I think if we look at growth challenges, we should look short and long term. In the short term, clearly the growth challenges are getting manufacturing growth and industrial growth to be truly robust again. Robust means in the 10 to 15% range. Because for us to achieve our ambition of raising the proportion of GDP that comes from manufacturing to 25%, we need to grow at between 10 and 15%. Manufacturing needs to grow at between 10 and 15% year on year for indeed the next 20 years. Right. And that's a major challenge. That's the immediate priority. That's going to come from a recovery in demand first and foremost, and then as a recovery in demand starts to feed into less and less capacity that companies have, companies then investing in new capacity building, and that will then be a virtuous circle of growth going forward. So that's the first priority. The medium-term priority is how do we, even if we get this manufacturing growth of 10 to 15%, how do we ensure that that manufacturing growth involves a lot of employment growth? Because we also have the objective of creating 10 million manufacturing jobs year on year to create indeed 100 million manufacturing jobs over the next several years. That's a much more challenging goal. That's at least a medium-term, if not a long-term challenge. That requires then a reform of the skills training program and the skills initiative. It requires sectoral changes where sectors that employ a lot of people like garments, textiles broadly, but garments in particular, electronic assembly in particular, the gems and jewelry industry in particular, the leather industry in particular. These are the sectors that employ large numbers of people, and we need to be a vibrant, good part of the world for these industries to thrive. If we are, then we will start seeing the manufacturing growth that we're looking for in the short term, and which I think will happen, start translating also into the employment growth in manufacturing, which I think is a much bigger question. Right. The long-term requirement, if you ask me, for growth is really to get our educational system right. We need to get our education system right at the primary level, but I think we also need to get it right at the higher education level. And in the higher education level, I think our problems are easily fixable. Our resources are there. It's an issue of really getting to grips with what needs to be done, and in particular with the state doing a lot less than it does now. It should stop trying to regulate the system and really look at how the institutions can be reformed such that the system grows on its own. Right.
So education, if you were to pick that up a little further, what would be the single biggest gaps in doing so? I mean, is it our ability and our thinking? Is it our ability to implement or implement efficiently? Or is it something wrong in the fundamental policy framework that we've been working with all these years?
So I think it comes from a wrong, more than anything else, it comes from a wrong reaction driven by the right motive, right? So we have the right motive. We say we want to improve quality in our technical institutes. Right motive. We want to make education affordable and accessible to all. Right motive. We go about it the wrong way. So when, for example, we say that we want to improve quality, how do we try and improve quality? We try and improve quality by regulating quality into the system, in spite of the fact that it hasn't worked for 20 years. So why should it work in the next 5 when it hasn't worked for 20 using the same approach? Instead of that, we should rely on two principles. We should rely on autonomy, forcing indeed autonomy of all institutes so that institutes can decide for themselves what curriculum they follow, what fees they charge, right? It shouldn't be dictated by either a state or central government, who they admit, right? And who they hire as faculty. Those are decisions that should be left to the institutes concerned. And then they should be forced to compete one with the other so that the poor institutes disappear. And the better institutes are the ones that thrive and grow and prosper. Now, that combination of autonomy and competition can be enormously powerful. That doesn't mean that there's no role for the state once it's got out of the way in many ways. there is a major role for the state in ensuring the right kind of assessment of these institutes happens, and these assessments are made public, that the assessments have to be done for all institutes, and those assessments should be publicly available to all students and their parents, so that they can decide for themselves which are the good institutes that are worth going to and which are not.
Right. So this is a policy approach or a policy thinking or design shift perhaps that needs to happen. If I were to ask you to apply this to something else that we are grappling with, you talked about manufacturing, that's a sector you belong to, and so on, what would be your response? Or rather, what would be the gap that you would seek to fill then, if you were to fix this problem at a much larger level, thinking much ahead?
So if we look at, take the second area that I mentioned about, how do we get employment generating manufacturing growth? Big challenge, tough one, right? It will come from a few interventions that we will need to make. One is what we're already doing and what the Prime Minister is doing extremely actively in terms of going out and selling India as a good place to do business. He's been doing it very, very actively. He's our #1 country salesman, and it's having results. The investment that Foxconn has announced, for example, you need a few of these big marquee names. We need that same kind of marquee name, a few of those coming in for the garment and textile industry. We need a few large garment or textile firms, whether from outside, whether from inside, investing in large projects.
So you're saying as a policy approach, focus on marquee
So just
investors.
a few, and those are not, that's actually not policy. That's what's being done very effectively just now, where it's a one-on-one contact, and if the Prime Minister of a country says to you, why don't you come here and do business, it's very difficult to say no, right? So you do, and you need a little bit of that, which is what we are seeing happening. We need to see it focused on garments and textiles. We need to see it focused also to a greater extent on electronic assembly. That will be one enabling piece. Then we need to look at why is it that we are an expensive place to do something like garments, right? Are we an expensive place because we do not have the right kind of infrastructure? Are we an expensive place because our logistics are poor? How do we start addressing some of those issues? Are there areas in the country that we need to set up the right kinds of facilities? Are we tying up our garment industry in knots because we restrict their ability to employ people seasonally and then not employ them when it's a low season? These are the kinds of very simple things that we can do. For example, there's a minimum wage policy. Now there's some word going around that we're planning to increase the minimum wage. If you want to actually kill the employment growth prospects in the garment industry, raise the minimum wage. So this would be an entirely counter approach to actually seeing growth in precisely the area that we're trying to say we want to see growth. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, listen, I want to see a much higher minimum wage and I want to see much more low wage growth in garments. I mean, one or the other is going to have to give.
So it goes back to the philosophy of public policy in some ways, right? So are we therefore, do we therefore have to focus first on that in an institutional, scalable way?
Well, if we asked 500 million Indians, that's our skills goal is skill 500 million of our countrymen, countrymen and women, right? That if we ask those 500 million, right, which would you rather have, right? A job at today's minimum wage in the formal garment sector, right? Or the current existence that you have relying on informal, unorganized employment. I mean, it's a no-brainer. Out of 500 million people, I bet 450 million will pick give me that job at today's minimum wage in the formal garment sector at today's minimum wage, right? So it's to me, it's a very clear choice. And I think if we raise the minimum wage, we're only catering to a small group, right, who are already privileged, and we're trying to give them more privileges. I think it's the wrong policy.
Right. So you're also saying that therefore policy framers need to go closer to ground to get a sense of what
and
young India really wants.
What really matters. What really matters and what's for the greater good.
Right. So when we talk about capacity building in public policy, so if I were to ask you to sum up, what are the 2 or 3 intervention points that you would argue most for?
So I think for capacity building, if we really want to build capacity in public policy, I mean, I'm struck by the fact that we have many really good bureaucrats. There is this view that the bureaucracy is the problem. I don't think that's true. I think certainly at the higher levels, the commitment and the competence is there in abundance. Right? What we need, we have a limited bandwidth, and we need to use that bandwidth selectively. So we need to pick those areas where we need to focus what bandwidth we have. So we need to focus our bandwidth on primary health. We need to focus our bandwidth on primary education, right? And we then need to focus our bandwidth on those few institutional changes that are required, that are one time, like in the higher education sector, where we can make the change, set the institutions and rules right, and then get out of the way.
Right, that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Mr.
Thank you
Forbes,
very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.